Welcome everyone to this video that is focusing on Macbeth Act 2, Scene 2. This is to continue working towards our WJEC English Literature non-examination assessment. Remember, this assessment is going to be worth an enormous part of your GCSE, so it's important that we understand all of the scenes that are critical to our viewpoint of Lady Macbeth. What we are learning today is how does Lady Macbeth act when Macbeth is committing the murder. We've already seen that Lady Macbeth acts differently when she's alone on stage as compared to when her husband enters. We're going to see how she speaks about Macbeth when Macbeth is actually doing the deed that she's sent him away to do. What I'm looking for is for you to understand what happens at the beginning of Act 2, Scene 2, to understand the dialogue, and to consider how Lady Macbeth is presented differently to Macbeth. In the last video I made for you, we looked at Act 1, Scene 7, and in that scene we saw how Macbeth was resolved not to kill the king. However, as Lady Macbeth started to use her language, use her words against Macbeth and to pressure him into killing the king, eventually he caves and decides that he is going to kill the king. What we see between Act 1, Scene 7 and Act 2, Scene 2 is Act 2, Scene 1. And in that scene, it's a very short scene, we see Macbeth speak with Banquo. Banquo's on his way to bed and he comes across Macbeth, who's in the hallways, and he tells Macbeth that he's been thinking about those witches and they seem to be preoccupying his mind. Macbeth tells him not to worry about that and sends him off to bed. When Macbeth then is on stage alone, he speaks in a fairly long soliloquy. One of the major ideas that he shows us is, he says these words: "Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand?" In the soliloquy of Act 2, Scene 1, Macbeth hallucinates. He sees a dagger in the darkness, almost like a ghostly figure, and he reaches out to grab it. And throughout that soliloquy, he becomes even more resolved to commit the heinous acts of violence that he is about to do in Act 2, Scene 2. Act 2, Scene 2 begins with Lady Macbeth alone on stage inside Macbeth's castle. It's very important to realise that she's alone at this stage. I've mentioned that previously, because when we see her with characters present, she will conceal certain things. She'll speak in a different way. Here, she is entirely alone. So what we see is her when she's unguarded from other people. "That which hath made them drunk hath made me bold. What hath quenched them hath given me fire." An owl shrieks. "Hark, peace!" It was the owl that shrieked, the Fatal Bellman, which gives the sternest good night. He is about it. The doors are open, and the surfeited grooms do mock their charge with snores. "I have drugged their possets, that death and nature do contend about them, whether they live or die." The first two lines that Lady Macbeth speaks seems to have two seemingly opposite pieces of imagery right next to each other. She begins with, "That which hath made them drunk hath made me bold." You can see that drunk and bold seem to be the opposite there. The drunker that those guards become, the weaker they become, means the stronger and more brave she becomes. And she does that in the next line too. She says, "What hath quenched them hath given me fire." By quenching, if we consider the idea of quenching, which means to drown or to give them something to drink or to almost wash them away, and then the opposite of fire, you can see that she's using these opposites, and there is a term for that in English literature, and that term is antithetical parallelisms. You can see that those two things are seemingly contrasting ideas, and yet Shakespeare is using them deliberately to show that the weaker other people become, the stronger Lady Macbeth becomes from it. It's almost like she feeds off the weakness of others, and it emboldens her. And that imagery, particularly of the fire there, it shows something about Lady Macbeth's character. Fire is dangerous and painful and destructive, but it's also wild, it's unpredictable, and it's untamable, much like Lady Macbeth seems to be. If You've also got that imagery of like a hellish, evil, a damnation type of imagery that we receive, showing that she is willing to spend eternity in hell if it is to give her that moment of pleasure on the throne. Got that real imagery of evil being used for Lady Macbeth, almost like a predator who looks for the weak and feeds upon them. When Shakespeare then has an owl interrupting her speech, that can be seen as symbolism for nature. Nature itself, an owl is a natural creature, and even nature is trying to get in the way. Nature is appalled by what it sees. This is not a natural thing. We could talk briefly about the divine right of kings here. The divine right of kings is a structure or hierarchy that people in the Jacobean society used to believe in, where everyone has their place. It comes from the feudal system. The king is on the throne because the king is God's representative on earth. And then you have the princes and you have the noblemen, and underneath that you have peasants and normal common people. And everyone has their place and everyone knows where they belong. What we see here is someone fighting against the divine right of kings. They're fighting against the natural order. And as a result, nature itself has been thrown into chaos. So what they're doing, it is unnatural. To commit regicide is to commit an act against God. And therefore even nature itself is calling out to stop this horrible thing from taking place. Now in response to that, Lady Macbeth says, "Hark, peace." She tells nature to be quiet. She's commanding nature. That again shows the level of power that she has, but also shows that unnatural level of power that she seems to exhibit. She then says, "It was the owl that shrieked, the fatal bellman." And the fatal bellman in Shakespeare's time was someone who announces an imminent death so that others can pray for them. So during Shakespeare's time, if somebody was about to die, very often you would have a bellman, and that bellman would make that noise, and the reason why they would do that is so that people could pray for the person who's about to die. And what Lady Macbeth is doing is she's refusing to give Duncan that privilege. She doesn't want people to pray for him. She doesn't want him to disappear into death peacefully and with the thoughts of others. She wants him to do it silently and that no one will be even aware that he's died. And then she says, "which gives the sternest good night." It's like she doesn't want him to sleep. She doesn't want him to have a peaceful, restful death. He is about it. The doors are open. When she says he is about it, she's referring to Macbeth. He is about it means Macbeth is doing what he's supposed to do. Macbeth has gone to kill the king. But when she says that, she also reveals that the doors are open. And the reason why those doors are open is because she has opened those doors for him. If we think of the imagery of open doors, it shows that there's nothing standing in the way of Macbeth and what he needs to do. Because she doesn't trust him, because she doesn't think he has the conviction, she has done everything she can to make this murder easy for Macbeth. She's removed all of the barriers. If we also imagine those doors open, almost suggests that coldness, like the evil is going to puncture the inner sanctum. If we think of a chamber, if we think of a bedroom, that's the place where most people should feel safe and comfortable and warm. If the doors are open, it means the coldness can rush in, the warmth can escape, but also the evil can enter. Here, Lady Macbeth is showing that she's opened the door. She's broken the loyalty and respect that should come from someone who is looking after the king. She then talks about the surfeited grooms do mock their charge with snores, and here she's talking about those soldiers who are supposed to be protecting the king. But in this case, they can't protect the king because they are snoring, which shows they are in a vulnerable position. These grooms cannot protect themselves, and the reason why they're snoring is because I have drugged their possets. She has drugged their drinks, drugged their goblets. If you take a look at that first person personal pronoun, it shows that she has taken an active role in this murder. She's not just left it up to Macbeth. She's done everything she can. She's the one who opened the doors. She's the one who's added those drugs. So she has really taken charge when it comes to this action. When she says, I have drugged their possets, she might not be referring to actual literal drugs. It might be that she has made these guards drunk, and they didn't mean to get drunk because they're on duty. So what she's tried to do is she's tried to make sure that these guards have drunk something that they didn't want to drink in the first place. She's very much taken charge, and she's very much forced these guards to do something that they didn't mean to do. Puts the king in a very vulnerable position, and that's exactly what she's looking for. At this point, Shakespeare reveals through his stage direction that Macbeth enters the stage, and in his hands are 2 bloody daggers. Now, whilst Shakespeare puts Macbeth on the stage, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are not there together at the moment. Macbeth is making his way through the hallways of the castle back to Lady Macbeth. It's not until the end of what you see on screen that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are in the same place together. So whilst they're both on stage, they're not aware of each other. Consider the very visceral imagery being used by Shakespeare here. Consider that red blood dripping all over the place. Consider those 2 instruments of death in his hands, those daggers. And that visceral imagery is supposed to show the heinous act that has been created. Macbeth has committed regicide. That thing he said he would not do, he has now done, and the evidence of it is seen right in front of the audience. The audience can see that Duncan has died. Macbeth says, "Who's there? What ho?" Lady Macbeth says, "Alack, I am afraid they have awakened, and 'tis not done. The attempt and not the deed confounds us. Hark! I laid their daggers ready, he could not miss them. Had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done it. My husband?" And that's when Macbeth comes towards Lady Macbeth. So you'll notice that Macbeth asks 2 very short questions as he leaves the chamber and as he makes his way back to Lady Macbeth. There are short, paranoid questions being used. It shows that he's been emotionally affected. He's asking, "Who's there? What's going on?" Possibly because he can hear the sound of that owl shrieking, and that's stressing him and that's worrying him. But he seems to be very paranoid as he's walking back to Lady Macbeth, almost as if he's in a trance, almost as if he has been affected by what he's done. Lady Macbeth then says these words, "Alack, I am afraid." And if we just stopped the sentence there, we'd consider Lady Macbeth to show the first signs of weakness, to show that she's not strong enough. However, she doesn't finish the sentence there. She says, "I am afraid they have awaked, and 'tis not done." This shows that Lady Macbeth is not scared of murder. She's actually scared of him not being murdered. She's scared of failure. She's scared that Macbeth hasn't been able to do what he said he would do. And when she says, "'tis not done," it shows that she has placed all of her thoughts into achieving her goals, not trying to maintain her innocence. She then says, "The attempt and not the deed confounds us." She knows that unsuccessfully killing the king is more dangerous than killing. Trying to kill the king is dangerous, whereas killing the king is less dangerous for them, because once he's dead, they can then work on the enormous act to conceal what's happened. What she's worried about is that Macbeth hasn't been able to do it, and that he's left them vulnerable to people knowing what their plan was. She then says, "Hark, I laid their daggers ready." And this continues from the section that we looked at just now, because it shows the level of detail that Lady Macbeth went through. She opened the doors, she made sure that those 2 soldiers were drugged or drunk, and then she actually laid the daggers ready. She placed the daggers in the right place. I think this might very well show that she doesn't trust Macbeth's strength. She doesn't trust his strength of conviction. Almost like she's doubtful that he's strong enough to actually do what she needs to do. So Lady Macbeth has taken the initiative and laid all of the steps out as simply as possible to make sure Macbeth goes through it. You've almost got that image of a mother who cannot trust their child. She's very much taking control of the entire plan and making sure it's successful. She then reveals, and I think these two lines are quite interesting, she then reveals, had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done it. She wishes that she was the one to kill the king. She wishes that she could have been that person. And the only thing that held her back from doing it herself is that Duncan looks like her father. Duncan looks like her father, which may suggest that there is some sort of family conscience that's holding her back. That maybe killing a family member is worse somehow than killing the king. So there is definitely some sort of weakness here, and this is an image that we'll come back to later on. She wishes she could kill the king, however, she doesn't believe that she could do it, because by killing the king it would almost be like killing her own father. Another thing that I think from this sentence is, does it reveal that Lady Macbeth was in his chamber? If she knows what this man looks like when he's sleeping, does that mean she was there at some point? So worth considering whether or not she would have the strength of conviction. All the way through, we've seen her telling us how she would, kill her own child if it meant that they get to game. But here, Shakespeare shows that she leaves it up to her husband to commit the act because she couldn't quite commit it because of that family connection. She then says, my husband, and that's when Macbeth enters. That's when her solitary nature is broken, and then she starts to speak to her husband. When Macbeth meets back up with Lady Macbeth, you'll notice that the page itself looks different to lots of the speech that we've seen before. When Macbeth is on his own, we see very long soliloquies where he considers the guilt, or where he considers what he should do. When we see Lady Macbeth on her own, again, it's dominated by a very long soliloquy where she calls upon the spirits. When we see the two characters together, very often we see Macbeth trying to explain something and Lady Macbeth not listening and trying to achieve her own domination. However, this time when we see the two characters together, they seem to take over speech from each other. Nobody is speaking at length. There's constant questions going back and forth. The whole thing seems to be interrupted. And there is a technique that Shakespeare uses, and it's an ancient Greek theatre technique, and it's called Stickermathia. What we have is we have two characters rapidly taking over the role of speech. They're moving from one person to the other, and that rapid flicking from character to character creates a tension, and it creates a sense of uncertainty with these two characters. And it also creates a sense of urgency. Lady Macbeth is desperately trying to get an answer out of Macbeth. Macbeth doesn't quite know how to respond. We also start to see a breakdown in communication between these two people. Up until now, they've spoken very honestly with each other. Now what we've got is almost language itself seems to break down, perhaps foreshadowing the breakdown of communication between these two characters the more the play continues. Now what we have from Lady Macbeth is an absolute desire for clarity, but with the use of Stickermathia, she doesn't get clarity. She simply gets more confusion. And if they are going to be successful, she believes that she needs to know all the information quickly, whereas Macbeth is not able to give her that information in the way that she wants it. What Macbeth says is, I have done the deed. Didst thou not hear a noise? I heard the owl scream and the crickets cry. Didst not you speak? When? Now? As I descended? Aye. Hark! Who lies in the second chamber? Donalbain. This is a sorry sight. A foolish thought, to say a sorry sight. So what we can see is the moment Macbeth speaks to Lady Macbeth, he speaks in a very deliberate, very slow, monosyllabic, blunt statement. I have done the deed. He almost seems despondent there. He almost seems appalled by his own actions. He can't say he's killed the king. He uses that euphemism because he cannot quite comprehend the evilness of his actions. You'll also have noticed the alliteration of I have done the deed. And that shows that he doesn't quite understand just how big a thing that he's done. And that D sound also gives us that sense of heaviness, much like Macbeth's soul is now heavy. All of that guilt is going to drag him down, and he's never going to feel as carefree as he has been in the past. He then says, "Didst thou not hear a noise?" And that question might very well show his paranoia. He thinks he's hearing noises. It's probably the owl that screeched just now. But he's skittery. He's a little bit worried. He's jumpy. Lady Macbeth says, "I heard the owl scream and the crickets cry." Those are the only noises that she's heard in the castle. And if you look at the two animals that are making these noises, the owl and the cricket, they symbolise nature. And nature, using the verbs scream and cry, is crying out in pain. Nature has been hurt. The hierarchy of the entire ancient England where we're set, or ancient Scotland where we're set, is crying out in revulsion, crying out in anger at the subversion of the natural order. She then asks, did not you speak? So she asks him a very clear question, did you speak? She's wanting clear information from Macbeth. And all of her answers to Macbeth's subsequent questions are all very clear and all very obvious. She then says, when he says when, she says now. As I descended, I. She is being very clear and logical because she realises if they are going to be successful, then they need the right information at the right time. She's calculating. However, Macbeth is not able to answer her questions. At first, he answers her questions with questions of his own that don't need to be asked. And then he says, "Hark, who lies in the second chamber?" He asks a question that is completely different to what Lady Macbeth was asking. And that shows that his mind has been affected. He doesn't have that clarity of thought at the moment because he's so emotionally affected by the murder that he's just committed. Lady Macbeth then reveals that Donalbain is the person who was in the second bedroom. And then Macbeth says, "This is a sorry sight." And that reveals just how horrified he is by his own actions. Consider the alliteration of sorry sight, or the sibilance, if you will. He's horrified by his own actions. He's appalled. He can't believe what he's done. He knows that this is an evil thing. And yet, Lady Macbeth takes exactly those words that he used, a sorry sight, and she converts them. She changes them to reveal something different. What she says, and she's almost chastising him once again, she says, "A foolish thought to say a sorry sight." What she's doing through the word foolish is she's mocking him. She thinks he's being ridiculous. She thinks he's juvenile. He's like a child who hasn't thought out the plan. She realizes that you think before the action, and then when the action takes place, you knew what you were getting into, so you deal with it. And what she thinks is that he is quite shallow in his thinking, because he's only thinking about what he's done, whereas he should be thinking about what he has gained. Macbeth can't move past the action itself, whereas Lady Macbeth is already thinking to the future about how they're going to get away with it and how they're going to prosper from this. So she uses the words "to say a sorry sight" to show that he is not thinking as he should be. He is showing weakness, whereas he should be showing strength. If we come back to the question that you'll be set for your non-examination assessment, which is examine how Shakespeare presents the strengths and weaknesses of Lady Macbeth, we've got a little bit more to comment on now. We can see how when she's surrounded by weakness, she seems to absorb strength. We can see that she's willing to do horrific things in order to gain materially. We can see that she looks for clarity and is able to control her emotions. We don't see any emotion from her. The king has been killed and all she wants is to gain from it. And she considers that Macbeth is being weak because he's emotionally affected by it. The only thing that we can start commenting on in terms of her weakness then is we start seeing that she couldn't kill the king because he reminded her of her own father. That's the only thing connected to emotion that we've seen so far. That's the type of emotion that Lady Macbeth wants to get rid of. That's the type of emotion that she wanted to get rid of with the creatures, with the spirits that would take away her femininity. So she hasn't quite been able to entirely suppress her conscience. It's the first evidence to reveal that there is still something inside of her that's holding her back. This video is only focused on the very start of Act 2, Scene 2. Act 2, Scene 2 carries on for much longer than this, and we start to see how Macbeth is emotionally affected, and we get to see how much more Lady Macbeth does and implicates herself in the murder too. We'll have a look at that next time. I'll release the video very shortly. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's been informative for you all. I will see you all next time. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.